So now we're going to start this video by removing the upper intake Plenum manifold on the Nissan 3300 V6 engine in its 4x4 light-duty truck application. Other procedure might require removal of the upper Plenum manifold, and that procedure will be removing of the injectors or changing the coolant tube which is bolted under the intake manifold Plenum. The upper Plenum manifold is only require removal if the left side valve cover gasket should need repair, or the idle air control valve is require servicing. We are removing this upper Plenum manifold to gain access to the left side valve cover. The upper Plenum manifold will require removal if you should have to change the valve cover gasket, which is what we're going to do as a part of this series. The upper Plenum manifold will also need removal if you have to change the idle air control valve, which is located in the rear corner of the Plenum. We will also take a look at the idle air control valve in series with this video. Let's start our removal process by removing the battery positive cable. Now, your battery cable may be in a different application, so you might want to consult the application manual for that removal. When we take a closer look at the PCV valve fresh air intake air hose, we will notice that it's teed off to the right side valve cover and also to the left side valve cover. This teed off portion of the fresh air will enter both sides of the valve cover on top, and it will exit itself right on top of the valve cover back into the intake Plenum. When we look at the left side valve cover, this is the exit for the fresh air, which will develop vapor, and the entrance point is at the same location. What I would have done in this application, I would have routed this hose down to the bottom of the engine block, inserting it at the top of the oil pan or in the engine block skirt. Reason being is that since the piston and its ring will see blow-by, that blow-by gas will enter the crankcase, which is the oil pan, and mix with this fresh air. That fresh air with the developed vapor will then rise to the top of the valve cover and exit its breather hose for the PCV valve to enter the upper Plenum. This would have been an ideal and more performing PCV breather system. This hose is the idle air control valve fresh air intake hose, and this hose is the PCV valve fresh air breather hose. We are not going to disconnect the mass airflow sensor, or we're not even going to mess with it, because sometimes this device can go bad just by bumping it around. From the notice of the brake fluid, we can tell that our brake pad is at halfway friction. Let's proceed and remove our upper Plenum manifold induction hose. is the procedure application for the accelerator cable removal. You do not want to remove the two adjusting nut on the coax cable cased in tube. It's preferably to remove the cable from its bracket fixed bolts, which are 10 millimeter. Anytime you remove the adjuster cable, you might change the adjustment from the factory. So we want to keep that the way it is. So we're going to start by removing the two 10 millimeter. As you can see, there is an adjustment on the cable because when you slack the nut, the cable moves up. So we're not going to mess with the adjustment. Now the trick here is we're going to lift the throttle open, slide the cable from under, and simply slide it out of its holding position. Now we're going to disconnect the Evap Purge hose. We will have to remove the Egr valve, so we're going to make room to detach the Egr valve from the intake plenum. We're going to do so by removing these two bolts, which is going to require a gasket. So before we remove these two bolts, we're going to try and remove the flange nut on the tube. This will save us from buying a new gasket. Let's first get some oil on the threads of the exhaust Egr tube, because all the threads are probably going to be corroded by now. These two little slots will simply be slide out from the metal tab. It will requiring some movement. Be careful, try not to break the plastic. As it ages, tendency may tend to do so. We will use a 12 millimeter socket, 3/8 drive ratchet with an extended handle. Remember, it's always best to get some oil on the bolts and nuts before removal. It's a pretty long bolt, so it's going to take some time. The other bolt in the front of the Egr will have a nut fixed to a bracket, if you notice it, right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my hand under the Egr tube, and you could actually grab the bracket that holds the bolt, the nut in place. Then you could turn the bolt out and bring the bracket out. This is the bracket that with the nut that sits behind the intake plenum and holds the EGR vacuum diaphragm valve in place to the intake plenum, and the bolt is the same length. Be careful with the hoses. They could get damaged with the needle nose pliers. Let's disconnect the harness for the transmission control. And this is the right side PCV breather valve hose. You want to be careful with this. This is a rubber hose. Most of the time it's going to need replacing because the oil has an effect on rubber itself. So it's best to replace this hose with a silicone hose or a neoprene hose. We also have to disconnect the harness for the oxygen sensor, which connects itself to the breather hose tube. You don't want to damage the clips because you're going to need them to replace the harness onto its holding retainer. If the harness is to be just left hanging on the engine during vibration, it will maneuver itself, it will get chaffered, and you could have a short in the wiring to the engine block. We're going to remove the 10mm bolts that holds the harness in place to the plenum, and we're going to disconnect the ground also. All our bolts are basically identical except for this one, which is the electrical for the ground. We're going to remove cylinder number 2 spark plug boot, and cylinder number 4 spark plug boot. And we're going to lay them to the side. We're going to disconnect the last cylinder, which is cylinder 6. We're simply going to disconnect the wire. We're not going to remove the boot. We're going to lay the harness to the side. Now we will remove the upper plenum bolts with a Torx socket, a 3/8 extension, 3/8 ratchet with an extended handle for extra torque. Sometimes you may want to tap the tool a little because dirt will build up inside the hex hole on the top of the bolt. So by tapping it is an effort to drive the tool all the way down to the bottom. Here we have stripped the top of the bolt with the tool, so we're going to have to use a different application for removing the bolt. We're not going to proceed to remove the rest of the bolt. We must first remove that one. We have already removed the first bolt. We will not proceed to remove the rest of the bolt because this is an effort to relieve the clamping force on this bolt itself until we remove it. Now I'm going to use a 1/4 inch Torx socket by driving it in the existing one with a hammer. You want to make sure you seat it in there very good. Now we're going to attach our ratchet and attempt to remove the bolt again. And again, it did not remove. The metal just completely gets stripped out of the bolt itself. It's a cheap bolt, or the bolt is proxied, or the bolt might be corroded. So we have tried a 6mm Torx and a 1/4 inch Torque, and none of them work because the metal itself from the bolt is being removed. So we're going to do the final procedure by drilling it out with a 3/8 cobalt titanium coated drill bit. Now we always want to get some oil on the drill bit itself because it helps cool the cutting of the two metal. Now you must understand, this is a high-dollar drill bit. This is not just your everyday hardware store wooden drill bit. This drill bit is designed for cutting hardened steel. And if you plan on doing the same, you should get a very good hardened drill bit. And that's the head of the bolt. Now we're going to proceed to removing the rest of the bolt. Then we're going to take the intake manifold off, and we're going to remove the remaining portion of this bolt. There's also a washer which you must be aware of. It's a locking washer. Now we're going to use a vacuum and get all the metal shaving out from the compartment. Now we're going to proceed our removal with the 6mm Allen socket. Now the trick is to removing these type of Plenum intake manifold, which is commonly referred to as a 90-degree Plenum intake manifold. Once you have all the EGR, and most of the vacuum hose removed, you're going to remove all the bolts that hold the upper Plenum to the lower Plenum, and then you're going to move the upper Plenum around. Just jiggle it like this. To see what else remain in connection. So once you have all the bolts removed, you're going to move around the upper intake manifold to see what other hose need removing. So we're going to remove this brake booster hose. This is the second hose we're going to attempt to remove. It is also a coolant hose for the upper intake manifold. We're going to need a long needle nose pliers to get down between the firewall and the rear of the engine to remove the C-clamp. This is a very complex part of the removal installation. I found this needle nose pliers with a 45-degree nose to be ideal for removing the clamp on the hose behind the intake Plenum. We will remove the distributor cap wire from its holding clip and the distributor cap from the distributor. This will give us room to lift the intake Plenum off the engine. Make sure you secure the screw. Make sure you secure the screw. You will have some hand room on this side of the engine compartment to remove the coolant hose from the intake Plenum manifold. You will also use a flat screwdriver to push the top of the hose down while you remove the hose. There is a tube in this area that you should be careful of. It will come in contact with the distributor. That wire will require disconnecting before lifting the manifold completely off. So this is the bottom side of the upper Plenum. These two plugs are going to require removal. One is the idle air control valve and the other is the temperature for the coolant. This is our Egr temperature sensor. These are the two coolant hoses that I spoke of earlier. These two coolant hoses will require removal. Be careful with the hose, and most of the time the metal spout will be rotted to the hose, so be careful. That is our Egr passageway. It has an aluminized gasket, and we're going to reuse gasket sealer for that. This is our throttle position thermostat sensor. We're currently experiencing a leak. From this sensing mechanism, so we will take it apart and clean it and fix the leak.